Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you listened to my story. Please give me a follow and like the video if you enjoyed it. Feel free to comment and provide feedback so I can improve the sound quality. Yes, we invite you to listen to part 2 of the series. Chapter 17. The Dark King, Chapter 17. Survival Training. Time flies, in the blink of an eye 3 months has passed. These 3 months, on daily basis they had long-distance endurance training. In addition they had, survival teaching program. It was a general term. It referred to methods and tactics tested over a long period of time. It was divided into 2 main categories, namely foraging and collection of resources. This was the basic ability that had to be mastered by every scavenger. Foraging is subdivided into water, shelter, access to food, and subsistence. Each course contains a wide range of content. The first is the water source course, which focuses on finding water sources in different environments. These environments are divided into 4 broad categories: jungle, desert, mountain, and swamp. In the jungle, looking for the water is much easier in comparison to the other environments. But organisms lurked in the jungle. Survival course taught how to avoid these dangers too. In addition to looking for water, there are water filters and different water quality testing and so on. Obviously, scavengers not only have to survive outside the giant wall. They also need to collect different parts of the water samples and bring back to the giant wall for the studies. Entire giant wall of Silva was a huge solid shelter. In addition to foraging, the collection of resources is also broken down into 4 major classes. The amount of knowledge is extremely large, namely mining, collecting herbs, geological survey, and exploration. Each of these ones, in normal condition, is a separate course specializing in a college. In other words, in the college one needs to study for 3 years one of these courses and they can graduate. But in here, within just 3 years, all of them have to learn. According to Toby, only after mastering everything they can survive. The 3 months for Dudien, the most difficult is not 8 courses, but endurance training and mining course physical training. Nevertheless, his progress in the last 3 months is extremely obvious. The first week it took him 30 minutes for full 5 laps of run. In half a month time he used 20 minutes for 5 laps. After half a month his timing decreased to 15 minutes. After 2 months he was given the right to eat breakfast, but he's still the last child to arrive during 5-lap runs. His physical abilities were affected during 300-year sleep in the frozen storage. However, his willpower was not affected at all. In the second month, the physical consequences of the frozen storage were completely eliminated. It would normally take another 3 to 4 months to completely eliminate. But in this month, super strength exercises sped up the process. His speed and endurance were amazingly upgraded as a result of daily training, and he was able to secure a place in the top 10. At the end of the 3rd month, he was already in top 3 according to the performance. This amazing pace of progress was noticed by all the other children. Especially Mason and 2 other boys who lived in the same with Dudien. They gave him a nickname, Mad Cow. The Law, the 2nd chapter, the normative role of law. In quiet library, Dudien was standing in front of the books of the law section. In his hands he was holding an introductory law book. Since the beginning of the 3rd month he was out in library for 10 minutes every day, which was the longest time he could squeeze out. "Dean, why are you in front of the law section?" I asked the teacher and was told that there is an examination today. Pay close attention to review the past knowledge or else you won't pass and will be eliminated. Another child who was reading books next to geology section spoke to Dudien. Dudien made a hand gesture, shush. He continued to focus on reading the basic law book. After 10 minutes passed, he gently put the book back into its place in the shelf. He turned towards herbal bookshelf and skillfully took out a book called Plants. He quickly rolled over the pages for a review. After making few confirmations he put the book away and turned to leave. "Dean." Mason quickly caught up, said, "Do you know what today's exam is about?" "I do not know," said Dudien. "I hope they won't test the geological survey. I have not had time to study." Macon eyes a turn towards Dudien and he smiles, "Most of the other things I can help you out with. If you have the chance, how are you going to help me out?" Dudien snapped at him, "No tricks. Do not even think of cheating." "Oh, come on. We can try to sneakily pass few answers. Mason bitterly said, I do not want to be eliminated. Teacher said that in case we will lose the qualification to be a guard and be eliminated. We have to pay for the course fee by ourselves. My family cannot afford such a high cost. Dudien shrugged his shoulders and said nothing could be done. Indeed, on the third day of the special training, Tobu had said these words. But Dudien has long known that the training camp is in fact used to train the scavengers. However, in name it is known as selection for guards. Even in case of elimination, most will still be the guards within the Silva's giant wall. As for Tobu's remarks, Dudien's was sure that it was just a speculation. Of course, for other children that was undoubtedly a bad news. It was also because of these words, most of the children who wanted to quit, clinged their teeth and continued the harsh training. Soon, both of them came to the school field. All of the children were gathered, talking quietly, trying to guess the forthcoming examination. It was not long before Tobu appeared punctually. As he came over, everyone meticulously stood in neat rows. This was the result of experiencing firsthand the pain of being kicked by Tobu. However, Tobu didn't came alone. By his side there was a tall graceful girl in her early 20s. Her face was full of mature sexy charm. It seemed as if she had lost her childish naivety long time ago. In fact, most of the 10-year-old children knew some aspects of knowledge regarding sex. As in this world, it was the legal age of marriage. After all, it was not easy for most people to live to 60 when radiation was so corrosive. Tobu coldly smiled and spoke in a consistent low tone, after 3-month training, you barely have the basic garbage guards qualifications. Starting today, every 6 months, we will conduct a final exam. All losers will be eliminated. Everyone was tense after Tobu spoke. Dudien also realized that the test is not a simple detection of knowledge, and soon Tobu's words confirmed his idea. This assessment is very simple. Instructor Chris will send you to a place where you only need to survive for 10 days. If you can be qualified to continue the training. Chapter 18. The Dark King, Chapter 18. The Desert. Can you guess what is going to happen in the next few chapters? To survive for 10 days. All children were confused. Although Tobu said it was simple, but after 3 months' time spent with him they already knew that his concept of simple was very far away from the original meaning of the word. All of them had expected the assessment to be a paper test, but were worried about which subject would be chosen. No one had expected that this time it would be a practical one. Obviously, to survive for 10 days, you must have grasped all the preliminary details of 4 courses from foraging class. Soon, some calculations were made. As long as there is water, the body's hunger strike limit is 7 days to 15 days. If the willpower is extremely tenacious, it's possible for a person to live up to for a month without food. That is, children only need to find a water source. There was a hope to pass through the practical exam. If the person was lucky enough to find a little food, they would be able to survive 10 days without any problems. Such a thought had greatly increased the confidence of many children. Dudien slight frowned. He was not too optimistic about the situation. If he knew anything about Tobu's style, then it was that Tobu would never test them with such a simple assessment. Children, come with me. At this time Chris, who was standing next to Tobu, spoke. Sister will take you to a fun place. I guarantee that you will like it. Some of the big boys heard her words, light burst out of their eyes. Line up. Chris smiled and turned to lead the way. All the children side by side, as a long team, were led by Chris. They came over to the school field. There were dozens of black carriages parked near the field. A single carriage was big enough to accommodate 7 or 8 adults, as for children around 10 to 11 of them could sit inside. Get onto carriages, Chris smiled. Dudien saw the youth who had came to pick him up from his house as a coachman in one of the carriages. Dean, come here, Mason greeted Dudien. Dudien took a look and walked inside. In addition to Mason, the other 2 children who shared the room with Dudien were present in the carriage. Mason had convened them to act together in the test and mutually care for each other. Obviously, as the people from the same room were the most trustworthy ones. Damn, the curtains are sewn here. Mason tried to lift the drapery to look out. A bad feeling poured into Dudien's heart. Is the test venue outside the giant wall? Dudien has closed his eyes, quietly listening and calculating everything since carriage had left the school field about 20 minutes ago. In the beginning he could hear the voices of passerby people, but gradually noises quieted down. After some time nothing but hoofs of horses and crackling of wheels were heard by Dudien. This silence lasted for another half hour. The carriage speed gradually halted and it came to stop. Dudien slowly opened his eyes. 28 turns, short stop for 3 times. The route taken should be to the west of the school. His mind repeatedly recalled the previously felt line. The carriage speed was very fast, so it felt very obvious when it was turning to right or left. If at the moment Chris knew what Dudien was thinking about, she would be stunned. It was not difficult to do what he did. As long as enough attention was given, any of these children could have done that. However, from the moment of entering to the carriage to the blockage of the windows, as well as the pressure by the possibility of the elimination, was especially designed to put psychological oppression on them. Thoughts of children were filled with apprehensions and worries, so no one paid attention to small details the way Dudien did. It showed how calm he was. That was the most important thing. The calmness of mind. The carriage's door was opened. Dudien immediately knew that it was not to check on them, but they had reached their final destination. The children quickly went down the carriages, eager to look forward the place which they have to survive for the next 10 days. It turned out to be a desert. The sand covered any and every place that they looked at. Survive 10 days in the desert. All children wanted to spurt blood. Dudien jumped from the carriage to see this endless hot desert. He could not help but sigh deeply. Sure enough, if Tobu said simple, it can never be so simple. Kids. Chris, with a charming smile on her face, clapped her hands, drawing everyone's attention. For the next 10 days you will be here. If you can't hold on, then just draw an X sign on the ground and you will be rescued. Of course, rescue means elimination. Similarly, it means costs of the special training will be burdened by your family. I believe you know the approximate numbers. If you don't want to ruin your homes, then do what you have to do and survive. She stopped for a moment, blinked for a few times and said, I wish you good luck. By the way, this is the first test and the most simple one. Then, turned to jump onto a nearly 3-meter-high dark horse. Dudien had seen this type of horse before. It was the same one as Fernando had used. Obviously, this also represented Chris's identity as a hunter. Dudien narrowed his eyes, looking at Chris, who whipped the horse and went away. The rest of the carriages also turned towards the same direction, maintaining the same formation, left away. Gradually they disappeared into the horizon. For a time, in this huge desert, only more than 300 children were present. Is this how to survive? This is murder. I knew it was not going to be so simple. Children's anger were direct at Chris, who led the carriage away. Ladies and gentlemen. A physically strong, tall child loudly called out, we have to unite. The first thing to do is to find water. As long as we can find water source, we can survive. The strength is in unity. Other children who hear him talk did not complain. Some heed his words, while few others began to think about a way to survive for the next 10 days. They began to skim through the knowledge that they had gained in the previous 3 months. Everyone had learned not to ask Tobu for advice, because they asked with their mouths, but Tobu answered with the fist. It was a kind of mental training too. The point was to raise individuals who could critically think for themselves in cases such as this. Dean, let's go with them, Mason told to Dudien. Since the first day, Mason and other children in the room were used to consult Dudien's views. In their room, even though Mason is the most charismatic, but the most prestigious was no doubt Dudien. No, the 4 of us will stay together to form a team. Dudien shook his head in disapproval. Macon was stunned. Why? The other 2 children also were puzzled. It was an absolute truth that if they grouped together with everyone, their strength would rise. Even the content of the course was based on this idiom. In harsh environments, if united, would have a much better chance to survive. They did not immediately question Dudien. It is easy to find water. But do not forget that we are in desert, not a jungle or swamp. Even if we find water easily, it would be scarce. It would be enough to supply needs of some, and ultimately the unity what you talk about will be disintegrated because of uneven distribution of resources, Dudien directly said. Macon and the other 2 children immediately woke up. Let's go, we have already wasted a lot of time. Dudien looked around, found a direction and left the place. Chapter 19. The Dark King, Chapter 19. Danger. There is always a plot within the plot. Mason and the other two children as one tried to immediately keep up with Dudien. Except Dudien's small team, there were 2 or 3 medium-sized teams. The rest of the children were hesitant. As if following the herd mentality, most of them formed a single large team. More than 300 people were formed into a colony-like team which gradually dispersed into the desert. Why are we going there? We are walking towards the sun. Mason raised his hand to cover his face from sun rays. It's been less than an hour but his body was sweating non-stop because of the heat. We seem to be at least in the same direction with the sun, another brown-haired child spoke. His name was Sham. One of the 4 sharing the room with Mason and Dudien. His character was boring. But as a person he was a diligent child. In addition to Dudien, he was the only person to stack his bed. Even if to avoid competition, we shouldn't have come this way. Mason smiled. Dudien whispered, in desert climate the temperature contrast of day and night is extreme. Even though it is Black Death season right now and the highest possible temperatures appear during this season. But in the evening the temperature will drop to the same level as Black Snow season. So we have to go to west as much as possible. As it will be the warmest place in the evening. 3 people heard Dudien solemnly explain. Mason bitterly said, if we went eastwards we could have avoided withstanding the sun and heat, even in case we couldn't find water source we would have gained more good than harm. And taking into the account the problem of insulation at night, how do you know the temperature will drop at night? My feet are burning, they are on fire. How the heck the temperature will be reduced? Sham and the other child named Zach were also very curious. It was so hot right now, so how could it get cold at night? You will know once it gets dark. Dudien did not explain the heat-absorbing and heat-dissipating effects of sand. This kind of knowledge was not taught during the studies in camp, so speaking about it would inevitably lead to doubt. And the concept of endothermic cooling, even if told, would not be understood by them. The water is sure to be found, the only thing we should pay attention to is to absolutely avoid getting sick. Dudien solemnly warned Mason, Zach and Sham. Zach, Sham and Mason were somewhat surprised hearing Dudien's assured words regarding the water. However, they did not question him, but were very curious. How would he find water in this desert that is full of sand? Where does that certainty and confidence come from? It did not take long before Dudien's team had lost sight of other teams. All what they could see were sand that endlessly covered the desert. They could not but get tensed and nervous at the sight. The only thing that teammates could do was to continue to believe in Dudien's judgment. He had never let them down during the training in the camp, so they hoped his judgment will be right in the desert too. Do you still remember the part where they taught us how to find water in the desert? Dudien stopped, looking around. I remember, we first have to look for shady sand and then dig until we find water, Mason said. Dudien raised his hand and pointed towards the front. There was a hill made out of sand. The side which he was pointing at was protected from the sun because of the angle of the hill. The sun could not illuminate that part even in the morning when it raised from east. Only at noon the sun rays would penetrate the sand, but for a small time. Let us go there. He stepped forward, taking the lead. As they reached the hill, Dudien touched the sand. It was very cool. Mason, Zach and Sham were delighted at sight. They squatted down to prepare to dig. Dudien waved his hand. First wrap clothing around your hand, so that it does not get scratched by stones. Then, he tore a fabric and wrapped around his hands and squatted down to start digging. Mason laughed, we are lucky that you are thoughtful. 3 of them tore of clothing, covered their hands and began to dig. It has to be noted that 3 months of endurance training had greatly improved physical strength of 4 of them. They had walked for 4 or 5 miles under the scorching sun, but they still had energy to dig. However, this was also kind of a gamble. Because in case they could not find water after digging, they would not be able to support their bodies to find the next possible place to dig for water. As a result, even Dudien felt nervous. Especially, after digging for half a meter depth, they were still touching soft sand. Let's end it here. We should move to the next place. Dudien decisively stopped. If they did not touch wet sand in this phase, even if they dug for 3 or 4 meters, there was a high possibility that they will not find water. We have done so much, so why give up now? Mason asked. Dudien replied with a sullen face, we can't gamble and hope to win now. Follow me, let's move on. Finished speaking, he turned to move out and walk forward. Mason and Zack were doubtful. They were unwilling to move on. Sham stood up and said, let's go. What Dean said was right. We can't bet now. Then he ran over to keep up with Dudien's pace. Mason and Zack sighed. They shook their hands on their knees to remove the sand. Now, when God closes a door for you, he won't open another one but will release the dog for you. Suddenly Zack screamed out loud, jumped half-meter high and hurried towards Dudien. Dudien and Shem turned back towards Mason and Zack. They suddenly saw a 2-meter-long snake drilling out from the sand. Its skin was brownish, the scales reflected the shining sun. All of them felt chilled over and over. Run! Dudien was the first to recover. He roared loudly, turned and ran away. The rest of the team members tried to keep up. Mason panicked and his feet stumbled. Plop sound echoed and he was thrown onto sand. Dudien was running in front, but when he heard the sound he could not but look back. He saw Mason on the ground and there were a bit more than 10 meters between him and the snake. Snake was twisting its body as if swimming on the desert sand. The situation became precarious. He turned back towards Mason and rushed to him. Sham and Zack were surprised for a moment. They also noted the fall of Mason. They saw the twisting body of Snake and their faces became extremely ugly and they become hesitant. At this point, Dudien has rushed to the front of Mason, grabbed his arm, growled, stand up. Mason leveraged to climb up and look back. There were 2 or 3 meters between him and the snake. If it jumped it would be able to pounce its body onto him. Mason was too scared, he hurried back. Suddenly Snake jumped towards Mason. It opened its mouth showing 2 sharp fangs. Chapter 20. The Dark King, Chapter 20. Alchemist. We will be having ads. Please disable your ad blocks. KTHX. Moreover, as I wrote in previous post, there is always a plot within the plot in this novel. At this moment, a gray shadow flashed by Mason and knocked the snake onto the sand. Run! Dudien growled. Macon recovered and ran away in a hurry. Dudien looked at Snake which began to twist its body towards him. He turned to run away as fast as possible. His jacket was tightly wrapped around his hand. Previously he hit down the snake thanks to the help of jacket which protected his hand from possible bite by the snake. So, I assume it's the sound made while passing Mason. Dudien quickly passed Mason and went to the front. In endurance training his results were the best in comparison to his flatmates. Running for a few hundred meters, Dudien looked back, but saw Mason and Rest keeping up with him. There was no trace of the snake. It should have known the failed to hunt so decisively gave up on them. After all, in such a harsh environment even animals tried to avoid useless consumption of energy while hunting down the prey. Dudien was relieved and said, stop running. It stopped to chase us. Mason, Zack and Shem looked at rear and noted that the snake has stopped chasing after them. The next moment they felt deeply tired, their throat were dry. They were thirsty and the weather was awfully hot. Scared me. Zack had a lingering fear as he patted his chest. Let's take a break, I'm exhausted, Shem breathed fast while panting. Mason heard the words of 2, suddenly looked up to the Dudien. He slightly nodded to Dudien said, Dean, this time you saved my life, after what? Do not speak. Dudien patted his shoulder, save your energy. Zack, Shem, we are not going to stop. It's possible for Snake to continue to catch up with us while crawling under the sand. We do not know that we are out of its hunting range. Moreover, it's getting late. We have to find water as soon as possible, otherwise it will be very difficult to get past tonight. Then, he continued to lead the way in front. Macon looked at Zack and Sham. He twisted his head right and left in disapproval and followed after Dudien. Zack and Shem looked at each other. Recalling the hesitation in the previous situation, they bowed their heads, without saying anything followed after Dudien. Dudien and crew continued to walk in westbound direction. All what they saw along the way was sand and dry clods. Except Dudien, other 3 could not help but wonder, if they went in another direction won't they be able to find water. However, at the insistence of Dudien, they did not change the direction. By dusk, they were walking forward almost and slower than a turtle. Their bodies were sweating, they were tired, their faces were tanned red. Found, Dudien's sound echoed. Mason, Zach and Sham's faces were as numb as corpses. However, as soon as they heard Dudien's voice, hope burst out of their dry eyes. Where? Mason hurriedly asked. Dudien raised his hand and pointed with his index finger. There was a small slope in front. Not far from the slope, there were some dry green grass and cactus, which were common plants of desert. Plants, plants. There of them cried in excitement. Dudien's face was also reflected a smile, said, if there is a plant then there must be water. All of them came towards the plants at the same time, but Dudien warned them, be careful, there may be something lurking here. Mason and other two nervously looked around. It was not long before Dudien began to dig the moist sand beneath the green grass. After a meter of sand was dug out, finally they got to see water. It was scarce and mixed with sand. It's dirty. How can we drink it? Macon and other two were dumbfounded. Dudien did not speak. He put the jacket that he previously used to beat the snake onto ground. He used both his hands to grab the water mixed with sand and filled onto the jacket. Later on he began to twist the jacket as hard as he could. He knew that jacket was made out of wool. So he used it to filter the water. As he continued to tighten the coat, the clean water began to flow down. They were thirsty for whole day. This simple filtered water was as delicious as a heavenly nectar for them. He drank a few mouthfuls. Dudien did not continue, but licked his lips with water, and then climbed up, said, do not drink way too much. It's good as long as the basic consumption of the body is met. There was admiration exposed in Mason and other two children's eyes. This grass could be eaten. Dudien pulled out the green grass. He kneaded the roots of the grass from the wet soil. Later on he broke them off. There was no outflow of colored juice, so he immediately bit and gently chewed it up. Faint sweet feeling diffused from the roots of grass and filled his mouth. It was a bit jerky, but he chewed carefully and then swallowed it. The other three saw Dudien and broke off the grass to eat up. So bitter. It's so hard to eat. Zach and Sham were not happy with the taste but still chewed and swallowed the grass. Dudien looked at the sky, said, tonight we should sleep in here. We should pick some dry wood to make fire through the night. By the way, one of us should stay on duty through the night. Let's pick the one who should stay on duty tonight right now so that he can sleep right now. I'll be on duty tonight, Macon said. If you go to sleep, we won't know what to do. Dudien nodded, then you go and rest, Zach go to find dry wood. Shem come over with me to build a shelter, find some stones. With his arrangement, all of them began to get busy with their allocated jobs. Outside the desert, there was a solitary pub. Because of the erosion of desert, the pub was half broken. Doors and windows have been repeatedly patched with wood. At the moment a man and a woman was sitting in the pub, drinking iced wheat beer. 360 people are to be assessed. How many can stay alive tonight? Chris asked while she was using dagger to gently fiddle with the ice inside the wooden cups. Tobu indifferent smiled and said, absolutely more than you think. Is it? Chris picked her eyebrows in teasing manner, wanna make a bet? Are we gambling? Tobu showed interest. How many people can stay after 10 days? Chris squinted, I bet 200 children. Tobu smiled and replied, I bet 300 students. Oh. Chris squinted at him. You seem to have confidence in your students. But this time you will lose. Tobu sipped the beer from the cup and asked, how come? Haha, Chris covered her lips with her hand said, do not you know, this desert in a decade ago, was the territory of the Ryan family. It was one of the 6 most prosperous families in the commercial district. Unfortunately, they were destroyed by an evil alchemist. The thing is not only the family was destroyed but its territories were desertified by that alchemist's evil forces. That was 10 years ago, I know, because I was there, Tobu said. Chris giggled, and said, but you do not know that evil alchemist who was killed by the Holy Church had left few things behind in this damn desert. Now there are some other evil alchemists who are quietly gathering in here. The thing is Holy Church has seen through their little tricks and knows about everything. Tobu's face expression suddenly changed, what do you mean? The Holy Church is ready to wipe out those evil alchemists that reside in here. But the problem is that they are hidden very well. In case Church sends a bright night over, suspicions will be raised. So to bring out those rats from their nests, another plan was made. It was on purpose that the scavenger examination site is relocated to here. These children will be used as bait to lure them out. And I believe those alchemists will fall into this scheme, as they won't try to miss the opportunity that is in front of them. Chris said with a smile. Chapter 21. The Dark King, Chapter 21. Night Attack. Happy New Year to all of you. Tobu's pupils shrank. He slapped the counter and said, "Are you the one behind the idea of using my students as bait?" Chris shrugged and replied, "I'm not so bold to do that, as I'm aware of your temper as we are old acquaintances. This arrangement was planned and decided by above, all we can do is to obey." Tobu's angry voice echoed, "Using a group of children as bait, ah. Is this how the Holy Church planned to lure the alchemists?" Chris' face slightly changed and she spoke in a low tone, "Criticism of Holy Church, even in private, is a big crime. Stop spouting nonsense. In case they are able to capture an alchemist, it will be a great feat for them. So in the future, if they are eliminated to join the guard or qualified to become part of the scavengers, this experience will be a valuable asset for them. You know that building a meritorious service is not an easy job. Well, do I have to thank them for this opportunity?" Tobu sneered. Chris said in helpless manner, "Whether you are pleased or ungrateful, it does not change the fact that situation is as is. Besides, if the assessment site changes at the last moment, suspicions would arise. These alchemists have a broad network. Moreover, after graduation, either as a guard or as a scavenger, they will be fighting on the front lines. They will face alchemists one way or the other, and nobody would be able to shelter them at that point. It's a valuable experience for them." Tobu frowned but didn't continue to argue. Instead he turned over to the old man behind the counter. "Old Luo, another cup. So much anger. Maybe I should give you more ice." The old man behind the counter laughed. Tobu stifled but did not say anything. The night came. As the sun went down, the temperature on the desert immediately decreased. Sand's insulation effect is very poor, so the heat was quickly distributed out. Dujian and Shem set up a fire covered by several stones to keep the flame in control. They used old dry plants to start the fire. They had managed to find enough firewood to keep the fire burning for the entire night. "I'm hungry." Zach touched his stomach. Dujian lied down near the edge of fire. He closed his eyes and said, 10 days will soon be over." Zach smiled and soon closed his eyes. Mason sat next to the fire and laughed, "Get a good sleep. It's too hard. There was hunger only, now in addition we have cold weather too." Shem was clutching his clothes lying closer to the fire. Mason smiled. From time to time he picked up firewood and they're into the fire pit. According to Dudien's instructions, the person keeping the night watch had to always keep the fire so that beasts didn't come close. Late at night, the temperature got much lower. From time to time a gust of wind blew. Even sitting next to the fire, Mason also felt cold shiver. His legs were slightly shaking. Because of frequent jitter and restlessness he suddenly had an urge to pee. He looked at the sleeping children. He stood up and walked away. He untied his pants to pee. In the darkness a dry palm suddenly stretched out and grabbed his throat. Mason's pupils contracted. His heart began to beat violently and the fear almost dented out of his eyes. He saw a wrinkled face in the darkness. It looked at him and spoke in a slight husky voice, "Good. Do not scream." All the hairs on Mason's body were erect. He wanted to call for help but nothing came out of his mouth as his throat was almost broken from the force of the palm. Nevertheless, because of moving his body few sounds echoed out in the darkness. Sand splashed from under his feet. Dudien's eyes suddenly opened. He slowly stood up trying not to disturb the silence. He grabbed a stone that was close by to fire. Not enough. Distance was far. Mason was desperate. At this time, the owner of the hand also noted Mason's action. Coldness swept through his eyes. He raised his other hand. Through the illumination of the weak fire, Mason saw the shape of dagger. So. Bang, a sound resonated. Mason's mind was completely blank. Dudien has used the stone to hit the dagger. Dudien began to loudly shout as soon as he saw the dagger drop down, "There are enemies, wake up." Zach and Shem immediately woke up as they heard Dudien's voice. They grabbed a stone and nervously watched their surroundings. Dudien was staring at the stature of the slim figure in the darkness. He was always a shallow sleeper, especially in a dangerous environment such as this one. He immediately woke up and opened his eyes, a sand grain splashed onto his face. He didn't see Mason, so he grabbed a stone in case of an emergency. But when he turned to look around, he saw the breathtaking scene. He threw the stone at a whim and didn't expect it to hit the wrist of the figure. "Damn!" the old man screamed, who was dressed in black robes. The dagger which he was holding fell to the ground. His wrist was slightly trembling because of the severe pain. In an angry state, he pushed the struggling Mason. He took out a small green bottle from his chest. He opened the bottle and curling green smoke began to float out of it. Without losing an extra second, he threw the bottle in Dudien's direction. Green smoke immediately floated. Dudien's face changed, hastily covered his nose. He wanted to remind Zach, Sham, and Mason to be aware of the green mist, but he was unable to speak as smoke was drifting close to him at fast speed. Plop! Sound echoed as Mason was enveloped by the green mist and fall down. Dudien's pupils shrank. He fall down and played dead. He did not see but heard two bodies fall down. He assumed that Zach and Shem also inhaled the green mist. He was just curious about, was the green mist a poison or just to make them fall unconscious? His heart was thumping fast, it full of tension and doubts. Is this one of the assessment? If so, he believes that, in exception to those large groups, other small groups will be eliminated. Is the purpose of this assessment to let everyone unite? Many thoughts passed in Dudien's mind. He could not help but regret. Perhaps the meaning behind the assessment was not about surviving for 10 days but to see whether they unite together. Damned little devil. At this point, Dudien heard the footsteps of the old man. They made me to waste a bottle lost soul's elixir. The old man spoke to himself. Dudien did not know what to make out of his words. He grabbed sand in his hand, ready to move at any time. At this time, Dudien felt a dry palm seize his foot. It felt as if there was no meat but bones grabbing his foot. He secretly thought about attacking the old man in case the other side wants to kill him. However, the old man seems not interested in killing him, as he pulled his ankle and dragged him forward. Dudien's heart sank. He couldn't bring himself to decide. Attack. Or continue to wait for the opportunity. Chapter 22. The Dark King, Chapter 22. The Creator. Dudien slowly opened his eyes. By the shimmer of fire he saw the old man dragging him toward the darkness. His eyes flashed, but he gave up on the idea of attacking. As throwing the sand at old man's back would not achieve any effect. Instead, he would lose the chance of surprise attack. Moreover, he had been dragged out for 3 or 4 meters. The best he could do right now was to grab a stone that was nearby the fire pit. But the stones near the fire were burning hot. Even if he grabbed the stone, he would have to casually throw it without aiming properly. I can't step into his lair. Dudien knew he was in great danger right now. Many ideas spun up in his brain. He had to do something before entering the lair. After all, he was not aware if there was someone else in old man's lair. He didn't want to be left in old man's mercy. The old man went back to the place where Mason wants to urinate. He bent down to pick up the dagger. Dudien decided the moment had come. His eyes fell on the side the fire pit where stones laid. He grabbed one. At the moment it was hot, but he could still bear the pain. He stood up and using the strength of the momentum threw the stone the best he could. Bang. The stone did not hit old man's head but hit his back. The old man cried in pain, stumbled but didn't fall. He turned to see Dudien running away. Never he would think that he will be played out by a kid not once but twice. Anger burst out of him. I'll kill you. He tossed his right hand forward. Something flew out of his gown's large sleeve. It hit Dudien. Dudien was thrown to the ground. His back was in pain. A pain so bitter that he almost fainted. His heart was in a loss. The old man should not be so fast to catch up. Was it a stone? He reluctantly looked back, his pupils suddenly tightening. He saw the scene completely beyond his imagination. A snake-like being which was attached to Old Man's sleeve was flickering in the light of the fire. It was as thick as baby's wrist and more than 3 meters long. Cuff was completely torn. Impressively, the external body part was attached to Old Man's shoulder and was rooted there. The most terrible though were the blood veins that were bulging on his arm's surface. It was looking strange, hideous, and disgusting. 2 words emerged out in Dudien's mind: biochemical transformation. Born in the family of scientists, Dudien knew that biochemical transformation is real. Only in the old days, experiments such as this were taboo. Any biochemical human experiments were illegal. In World War II was the only occasion where they were publicly used as weapons of war. He had heard his father and sister chat about experiments of this kind. But he would never expected to see this incredible scene in a world which hadn't had an industrial revolution. Dudien was shocked. The contact point of Old Man's shoulder and the transmutation grew for a few centimeters. The new section was stained with large number of silky tissue fluids. Old Man stared at Dudien. "The little devil, I will not kill you so easily. I will cut you into tiny bits. Actually, you shall become part of my experiments." Finished, he took big steps toward Dudien. Dudien's face was pale. At this moment he finally understood that it was not part of the assessment but a real danger. He wanted to get up but back pain was so bad that he couldn't move. Moreover, the previous time when the old man had used the green fog, although he tried his best to hold his breath, but it had still affected him. He felt weakness in his limbs. "Want to run?" Old Man looked at him ferociously. He used his big hands to grab Dudien's hair and dragged him away. Dudien grasped onto Old Man's wrist in pain. It felt almost his scalp would be torn out. The men stopped dragging him. They were in front of a pit which Dudien had seen before. "Roll in." Old Man kicked Dudien's body into the pit. Dudien rolled down. Along the way his body hit quite a few stairs. His arms and back were in extreme pain. After a few breaths his body hit the ground. He saw the place illuminated by the dim light. He was in an underground chamber. At the same time, an old man climbed down the ladder. Dudien looked up and noticed that the entrance to the chamber was covered in wood. Most probably one of them passed through the top of the shelter and alerted Old Man. He smiled wryly. Wherever the plants were dense would also be abundant with the water. Logically, that would be the best suitable place for a shelter location. He should have thought about it. Old Man didn't even care to look at Dudien but quickly came to a table not far from the entrance. There were lots of pills and vials on the table. He mixed and poured few of them in a glass of water and drank it. Dudien looked around. He saw few cupboards standing next to each other. There were large glass of bottles on cupboards. Some of them had human hands, while one had a woman's head inside it. The rest of the bottles contained hearts, lobes, and other organs. Old Man noticed Dudien's eyes. "Don't be in haste. I'll find a big container for you too." Dudien's face became ugly, said, "Holy Church said that people like you have sold their souls to the devil, right?" Ricky Old Man scoffed and said, "The devil? The Holy Church would use the Creator and the devil argument to fool the world. When I finish with my experiment, I will be the Creator." "What experiment?" asked Dudien. Naturally he was not interested about the experiments. He wanted to use the conversation to buy some time to restore his physical strength. Even to think of a way to get out. Old Man sneered, "Don't even try to attempt to run. Do you know what this is?" He opened a drawer and took out a small crossbow. Dudien's face changed, the situation was already against him. However, he didn't give up. Biting his teeth he continued, "Why would the Creator use the murder as a tool?" "Well, it's the wisdom of the Creator, it's not possible for you to understand," said the old man and sneered, "Great alchemy will cast immortality and you should feel honored to be the material to my experiment." Alchemy. Dudien hesitated. He had some knowledge about the introduction to the alchemy. It could be said that it was the foundation to chemistry which originated in Egypt. Conversion of a base metal into gold was one of the aims of alchemy tales. However, the ultimate goal of alchemy was to create philosopher's stone or sage's stone. According to the legend, it could turn a person into an immortal. In history, there have been many great people who were exposed because of their practice of alchemy. Even the famous physicist Newton was an alchemy enthusiast. Are you an alchemist? Dudien looked at the old man with alarm. Isn't alchemy about turning metal into gold? Old man squinted his eyes and said, I did not think you knew so much. But there are two alchemist factions. One school studies the basic materials to manufacture the philosopher's stone to gain the eternal life. The other group, including me, study the living things to create life, to become the creator. Chapter 23. The Dark King, Chapter 23. Retaliate. Dudien understood how the old man's arm had become like that. Most of the experiments done by the alchemists were carried out on their own bodies. Though from the results it was clear that the experiment had failed. The additional limb seemed to follow the nerve system signals for taking action. But each action taken has to be paid by a corresponding price. Otherwise such a body mutation in an era such as this was definitely an unstoppable war weapon. Oldman seemed to want to rest, so he spoke to Dudien in a cold voice, go there. Old man's palm touched the small crossbow. He wanted to give the impression that if Dudien refused to move, he would immediately shoot. Dudien stood up. In this life and death moment he was anxious and his mind was in mess. He took deep breaths so that his mind would calm down. His body trembling, Dudien began to move towards the table that Oldman was pointing to. It was a large table. On its edge there were a number of tools used for cutting. Some of them were stained with blood which had not been washed clean. Dudien heard sounds coming from his left side. He turned to see a large cage. There were more than a dozen snakes twisting inside the cage. Obviously these were the other captured materials for the experiments. Oldman did not urge Dudien but quietly watched him. As if the hunter was watching the prey attempting its final struggle. When he saw Dudien's expression change, his mouth slightly curved into a cruel smile. At this time, Dudien has come to the table. Do you see that chain? Tie your arm. Oldman ordered Dudien. Dudien looked at few chains fixed on the workbench. Most of these chains and tools were used beforehand in experiments. His eyes flashed but still grabbed the chain and wrapped around his wrist. Old man's face reflected trace of disdain and sneer. As Dudien would chain himself up, he would go to cut him alive to death. Bang. Dudien squatted down. At the same time he shook the chain and hit the cage. The snakes began to twist and struggle in an attempt to escape. Oldman spoke, little devil. You just have to act like a smart ass, don't you? Do you think you can escape from here? Now, you obediently come out and I will forgive you for once. Dudien naturally refused to believe old man's words. He began to kick the iron cage. He was using the table as a cover from the crossbow that Oldman held. His aim was to get close to Oldman so that he will have the opportunity to wrestle him. Although the old man had an external amputation to his body, it took a lot of willpower and mental exhaustion to command it. Fatal point of using something like that was that it would terribly weaken him. After a few kicks, the iron cage fell down onto the table. Fortunately one of the doors were opened and a dozen snakes sidewind out of it. Some of them moved towards the darkness, few towards the old man and the most towards the Dudien. Oldman smiles, there is no difference of life and death to me. The next moment, his smile suddenly paused. He saw the serpents that were moving toward Dudien changed their direction. Few of them bent around to move other places but 4 or 5 of them moved towards him. How? Old man's eyes went wide. He suddenly looked to the table. His face was gloomy, no wonder he had the courage to shake the snake cage. Dudien clutched his hand. There is a small bottle of powder. He was spilling it all over his body. He had previously bet on this bottle of powder. It must be something that Oldman had used while capturing the snakes. Even though the Oldman refers to himself as alchemist, but in essence he uses chemical elixirs. So the Oldman couldn't have seized all these serpents unarmed. He had to rely on other things. The results of his logical deduction was as he had expected. As he was moving towards the table he had seen the bottle of the powder on it. Perhaps it had been too long since someone except the Oldman had been here. So he had placed many things on casual manner on top of the table. Dudien had secretly grabbed the bottle while moving. Humph. Oldman grabbed a brown robe that was hung on the wall. He quickly draped it over his body. As a result, the serpents who were moving toward him immediately stopped, twisted their bodies and swam to the surrounding darkness. Dudien understood that the dress was gown in the same powder and most probably was used in catching the serpents. "Kid, you better be obedient." Oldman was staring at the table. The crossbow was in his hand. As long as Dudien showed his head, he would immediately shot. Although Dudien was a child, but one after another time had created misfortunes. Dudien had made Oldman feel threatened, so he was not going to give any chance to him. Dudien looked around the chamber. The only way to survive was to subdue the alchemist. He had a dagger, but it was far from enough. He had taken the opportunity to grab the cutting tool from the table, which was similar to a dagger. At this time Dudien saw a large number of accumulated bottles and jars on a board near the fallen cage. There were labels stuck over them. Impressively, 2 of them were sulfur and charcoal. This was one of the main raw materials of the gunpowder. Dudien's eyes light up. Heart ecstasy suddenly, quickly looked around, but did not see the nitric acid. He was disappointed as sulfur and charcoal was not enough to create gunpowder. He clenched his fist. He felt as if he acquired a chance to survive, but to be slapped back at the same moment. "I know, you have a dagger in your hand. Ready to fight with me, don't you?" Old man's voice sounded again. Dudien's mind sank. It seemed Oldman has noticed him taking the dagger. "Are you hungry?" Oldman continued. As he heard him talk, Dudien felt the hunger of the day. His stomach juice was burning up. However, his heart is a little relieved, at least he has time to continue to think of a way. At this time, the green mist floated. Dudien's pupils shrank, and quickly covered his mouth and nose. He did not expect the other party would even release this thing in the narrow chamber. Apparently Oldman had antidote or other kind of measure to respond. Dudien pinched his nose. His heart was beating fast, knowing that his time is running out. He didn't stand up in desperation, as the other side may have aimed the crossbow at his position. As long as he stood up he would be shot. He slightly gritted his teeth, clenched the dagger. Looked at powder on his other hand. He was ready to throw it out. An idea flashed in his mind. Chapter 24. The Dark King, Chapter 24. Desolate. "Little devil, let's see how long can you hold." Oldman was wearing a dark green mask, only to reveal a pair of cold eyes. He was staring at the table. His fingers were on crossbow, ready to shoot at Dudien at any time. A shadow suddenly flew out from the table. Old man's finger instinctively clicked the trigger of the crossbow. It ejected out a short arrow which flashed quickly but didn't shoot the shadow. It was nailed at the rear of the wooden cabinet. At this time, a bottle of powder fell in front of Old man's foot. His face changed and quickly looked up to see Dudien jumping up from the ground. He didn't bypass the work table towards him but to the cupboard. Dudien casually grabbed the bottles and jars and threw them at Old man. Old man's anger burst to sky. It was very hard to collect all these of experimental material. To see them casually knocked on the ground was making him crazy. He filled another short bow onto crossbow and aimed at Dudien. However, in his short time to refill the crossbow, Dudien had already once again retracted back to the table. Damned little devil. Old man's angry eyes almost spit fire. He had missed shooting Dudien the second time. If he heard it before that he would feel threatened by a small child, he would laugh at the idea. "I'd like to see how long you can hold." Old man's checked the green fog that was diffusing into the chamber. Got it. Dudien was holding a large glass bottle. It was the bottle filled with sulfur which he had seen before. At this moment he felt suffocated as there was less oxygen as a result of green fog. Unfortunately there was nothing to fire it. Damn it. No fire, no fire. Dudien's mind was in despair. As he was desperately thinking about a way out, his eyes concentrated on the wooden wall where shadows were reflected. The oil lamp, he whispered to himself. How I haven't thought about the oil lamp. Dudien was in joy. The despair in his heart vanished. He quickly used fabric torn from his shirt to cover the sulfur bottle. He clenched his teeth. His life and death would be result of the success or failure of this move. Oldman saw a large group of flying shadows. By nature of self-preservation he shot the crossbow. The short arrow penetrated one of the bottles. But another one which was aimed at him was not affected. In hurry he raised his left arm to block the oncoming shadow. Unfortunately for him, he blocked the bottle covered with fabric. It cracked and some of the sulfur fall onto his arm and clothes. He swayed his arm which hit the table when another bottle hit the oil lamp and overturned it. Dudien saw the fabric burning up, so he quickly lied down. Bang! Suddenly sound of thunder-like explosion resounded in the chamber. Few pieces of the wood on top of the chamber cracked and fall down. Dust filled the room. Dudien felt a massive destructive force hit the table and which was reflected on his body. He felt as if his ribs were going to break. Tears flowed out of his eyes because of the pain. At this time he couldn't control his slow and restrained breath. As a result he inhaled large amounts of air. There was flavor of burned sulfur. Moreover he inhaled remnant of the previous green fog. His limbs felt soft. Top of the chamber collapsed at some parts. The cold wind circulated inside the chamber which rolled out the air filled with smell of sulfur and green mist. He slowly began to inhale the fresh air. Dudien immediately began to crawl because there was a big blast in the chamber and nobody knew when it will completely collapse. He did not want to be buried alive. As a result of the previous explosion, the oil lamp had blown out. At the moment the chamber was immersed in darkness. Dudien began to move towards the old man's direction even though he couldn't see what was in front of him. He relied on his previous vision to remember the distance between him and the old man. It didn't take long before his hand touched a wet, sticky but hard objects. His face became ugly. It was the bones of old man. Although in the dark, Dudien knew that all that he touched were the part of the body that had remained after the explosion. He didn't expect the power of this sulfur explosion to be so terrible. It was not made into gunpowder, so the reason for it to be so effective should be because of dust explosion principle. I killed a human. Dudien's mind trembled. A living human was killed. He had seen the situation of poor in this world and at some point faced the distortion of the law. But to personally kill someone, he did not dare to think about it previously. He was slightly shaking. He secretly whispered in his heart, it was just self-protection. I wanted to protect myself, so it's not a crime, not a crime. His heart was filled with sadness. The proper laws has long since disappeared from the world, so even if it was a crime, who can give him a conviction? In this dark pit which was illuminated by the starlight, he suddenly felt so lonely and desolate. Gradually he let his body relax. The fear in his heart disappeared. Instead a kind of faint indifference was born. He silently looked at the derelict part of the old man's body. His body slowly moved, not to leave but to explore. He checked the crossbow. Chapter 25. The Dark King, Chapter 25. Alchemy Notes. Hopefully in few hours we will have another 2 chapters. Hopefully. Faintly, Dudien once again touched old man's body. Even though there was a fear in his heart, he was not as nervous as he had been previously. He touched down the robe. He found 2 objects wrinkled in robe. He moved the first object towards the sky to identify it in the starlight. It was a small sickle used to ignite fire. His heart was pleasantly surprised. He tried hard to use the friction from fire sickle to ignite a small torch. Soon a small fire was used to light the darkness. He clearly saw old man's fractured arm from the elbow. Ribs of his chest were blown and the rest was charred. Dudien's heart beat fast. He confirmed that old man's chest didn't undulate, so he felt more relieved. There were papers scattered on the ground while pieces of the cloth worn by old man's were missing because of the explosion. As the fire got bigger, Dudiens could see the appearance of the chamber after the explosion. All kinds of equipment were thrown to ground and damaged. Some of the things were buried under the sand which had flowed from outside. He looked at the crossbow which had its strings broken. Obviously it could not be used. Dudien's mind was distressed. He was preparing to fire the chamber to completely burn it. Suddenly he saw quite a few books on the other side of the chamber. He got close to the bookshelf and the first book to catch his eyes was named Alchemy of Life. In addition to Alchemy of Life, there were several alchemy books. There was a small manual with no name imprinted on it. He took it up and opened it. Alchemy Notes. Dudien was surprised. He checked the content of the manual. It was Actually, the old man's alchemy diary. Giant wall calendar. Year 287. The black snow season. Today's experiment is progressing smoothly. Sure enough, to create life I have to use humans as experimental materials. The problem is how to find the perfect material. Dudienne rolled the pages. There were some records of the experimental process and other events. He didn't look into details, instead hid it inside his cloth. As for the Alchemy of Life and the other books, he simply skimmed through. Although the naming of the books were pretty impressive, but they all give the feeling of primary biology books. He did not take these books as they were too thick. It would be hard to hide and they will be easily exposed. From Old Man's actions he knew that alchemy in this world didn't have a good reputation. Or else he would not hide in this desert to secretly do experiments. Dudienne ripped the books, threw them on the flames, and burned the fire. He threw the rest of the books on the body of the old man. Later on he found the oiler, which had fallen to the ground, and poured the oil into the old man. The first thought was to destroy everything. As the fire spread, Dudienne ascended the wooden staircase he had rolled down. He climbed out and looked back. From the gap he could vaguely see the reflection of the fire. He had a hint of melancholy for a moment. He sighed, turned and ran along the route towards their camp. He came back to see the fire pit burning but couldn't find Mason and the other two. Dudienne refused to sit down and rest, dragged his exhausted body around the ground looking up. Soon he saw traces of traction, immediately followed the sand marks. In a distance he saw a shadow moving. As he got closer he saw Zack dragging Mason and Sham. Wasn't he affected? Dudienne was confused. Then he thought back. Zack had always been a cautious character. Most probably he had played dead the same way as Dudienne had done. Dudienne's heart warmed as he saw Zack struggling to drag Sham and Mason. He tied alchemy notes onto his leg with a belt and went after the Zack. Who? Zack jumped in fear as heard the sounds. He released Sham and Mason and nervously bent over to grab sand. It's me, said Dudienne. Zack heard Dudienne's voice. He was surprised. You come back. Are you all right? What happened to that monster? Hearing this, Dudienne understood that Zack had secretly watched him and the old man while they fought. Moreover, he had seen the mutation. I'm lucky to run away. We should leave quickly. He grabbed Mason's arm and saw him still breathing. He was relieved to know that the green fog was not a lethal toxin. Zack's face a white because of fear. He could not help but look behind Dudienne as if the monster was gazing at them from the darkness. He shivered and grabbed the Sham and said in hurry, run. Let's not get caught again. Dudienne dragged Sham following in the back. The water was sufficient in that place. Although the old man was dead, but there was no guarantee that there won't be other alchemists who would come to visit. When they find the next water source, at least he would be more experienced. Half an hour later. Above the old man's secret chamber, few shadows appeared. The shorter one pulled out a small oil lamp and lit the fire. He looked through the gap down to the chamber. He saw burning fire inside the messy room. Has been killed. One of the shadows, a graceful figure, seemed to see what had happened. Her voice was full of chill as she continued, the corpse it ruined. The den is burnt. It seemed they didn't want use to trace any clues. These beasts and their vicious methods. They are really the apostles of the devil. Another burly figure gloomily said. The alchemists have long sold their souls to the devil, he said, to get the power of the devil at all costs. Killing each other is nothing for them. But they should not fight with each other for no reason. I think there is something very important that made them fight each other. It would be very good if we had come earlier. Look at there. What kind of force was released in here to instantly destroy it? The previous graceful figure was pointing inside the burnt chamber, and the collapse of the gap, said, it seems these alchemists had terrible devil power. Chapter 26. The Dark King, Chapter 26. 10 days. You see, there are footprints, burly figure suddenly said. 3 immediately looked to the side of the sand marks and footprints. The graceful woman's face changed, said, it is the footprints of children. Damn, this alchemist was involved in human experiments. I've looked down on him. Then, from the gap created by the collapse, she jumped down. A moment later, she jumped out from the inside, firmly standing on the stand. If Dudien here will be stunned. The height of the chamber was at least 3 meters in height. To jump that high, how strong physically you had to be. This one turned out to be a life alchemist. Graceful woman was holding a dark metal. Above it there were 3 5-pointed stars, engraved on it. According to alchemists' belief system, they refused to believe in the creator or father. But in the sky over their heads, some crazy alchemy warlock's ultimate goal was to refine the stars. These alchemists diverted into another occupation known as the star diviner. Star diviners only did divination for persons' fate and destiny. They were hunt by Holy Church too. The reason was very simple. The Father's will could only be passed to Holy Church. Only the great Pope could understand any attempt on understanding the will of the Father. Anything else was only a speculation by the evil cults. I did not expect him to be a powerful figure. Burly strongman, eyes condensed, a certified 3-star alchemist should have extraordinary power. To kill him there had to be many other alchemists, or maybe even a 4-star alchemist. Graceful woman's face was gloomy at this point. Order some people to dig this place to get captive children's bodies. At least their parents should be comforted by this, because they had died because of this assessment. I hope we can identify their appearance. Short one sighed. Graceful woman did not say anything. You look for clues in the vicinity. I will take the body of the alchemist over to the knights. By the way, check out everything inside the place. Burly Brawny finished speaking, jumped down. Graceful woman and Short Shadow as one pulled out their weapons. They went around in search of clues. In the blind of an eye, 10 days passed. Dudien and the other 3 were leaning against each other near some desert plants. Limitless sand was covering their vision from all sides. Their bodies were dry because of lack of water, resulting in a sharp increase in their body temperatures. 10 days, Mason was listlessly chewing grass roots and said, "Do we have to back on our own? I have no strength left. If we haven't relied on Dean, we couldn't have hold for these 10 days. Imagine what would have happened if we were eliminated. Most probably we would have ruined our family's financial situation." Sham said. Mason rolled his eyes and said, "That I always say. Dean, you are my savior." Dudien glanced at him, and said, "You know that I am your savior, but you didn't want to give me a bit of water last night." Mason face reddened, said, "I was too tired and a bit dizzy. As we go back, I will pour water to you every day. I would even ask my grandmother to serve for you." Dudien shrugged. "I do not want to be your grandpa. Do you take me for a cheap person? You have the strength to speak thou." Zack was sitting on the other side. "Then you should be the one to go back and tell everyone that. We are stuck in here. I was wrong. I was wrong. I do not have the strength now. So you should go and inform them. I will owe you. You are nothing but a dirty slut." Zack turned over. In 10 days 4 of them had experienced lots of adversities together. Throughout this survival, they long had become like real brothers. They no longer take into account what they tell to each other. And as a result, Sham, Zack and Dudien had become to appreciate the unknown side of Mason. That is playing cheap. Tink. Tink. Suddenly burst of bells sounded. They turned to see a nearly 5-meter-high camel slowly walking on the desert. It was dragging a 10-meter-long plank. There were 7 or 8 children seated on the plank with wheels. Dudien was stunned. Nuclear radiation had great effects on the world. But he would have never expected camels' genes to be inflated by the radiation to such a degree. In addition to its size, which was twice the normal camel's, there were snake-like scales covered on its hooves, just like a war monster. He had previously seen the 3-meter-high dark horse. But this camel was immeasurably affected by the radiation in comparison to the horse. "It is a camel." Zack actually recognized the animal and spoke in surprised manner. "It is the best animal that could be used in the desert, ha ha." He wanted to laugh, but the wind blew the sand into his mouth, almost choking him. Dudien saw the children on the back of the board. These ones should have passed the survival assessment. The trial was successfully concluded. He was also relieved. Finally he would be able to go back to have a good rest. He would have a chance to look at the alchemy notes. He was quite curious about the scientists of this world. "Come you four," said the woman, sitting on a camel, wearing a veil. Dudien and others immediately dragged their bodies, moved past the camel and went towards its rear to sit on the board. "You four survived." At this time, a thin boy sitting on the board talked to them in a surprised manner. Dudien looked at him. He remembered the boy to be living the bedroom next door to them. He smiled but didn't reply to him. Mason proudly talked. "I think you don't know who we are. We are the strongest four-man team. A mere 10 days to survival in the desert does not even count as anything to us. Maybe 25 or 30 days would be a bit difficult." Shem whispered, "Stop bullshitting if you want us to be friends." Zach shrugged, his nature has been exposed and he won't turn back from it. Mason laughed hard. His laughter turned the atmosphere of silence on the board a bit onto positive side. The thin boy sighed and said, "Me and other 3 flatmates did not stick together. You guys are pretty lucky." There were loneliness and regret reflected on his face. After all, his flatmates had separated from him, leaving him with others. Other children who heard his words were depressed as most of them had faced this kind of a situation. Dudien did not say anything. He looked up at this woman on the back of the camel's hump, in his heart thinking about a problem. How did she climb up? Chapter 27. The Dark King, Chapter 27. Rewards. A friendly reminder, don't forget that the MC is a kid. Literally. You should not have expected him outdo a normal wuxia/xianxia MC. Dudien and rest were sitting on the board carried by the camel while they were coming close to the gathering place. There were many students standing high and mighty. Although the overall number of students were much smaller than before, but it was still a very impressive result. There are so many people who are qualified. Mason was surprised. Most of the children came from a variety of families, but at the end of the day they were trained by Tobu. It didn't matter whether you were weak or a girl, after the training a transformation had occurred on each of them. They had gone through very harsh endurance training before the assessment. Moreover, in the desert survival assessment, endurance was only a supporting role. To survive through, you had to rely on luck and brains. I did not expect so many powerful people. Mason spoke with some emotion. I thought we were the only ones to desperately try to survive. Never thought that same conditions applied to everyone. Everyone was aware of the difficulties of the 10-day assessment. The thought that they had survived was already a miracle. But overall, everyone understood that to finish the course, they could not simply continue with their current efforts. They had to push themselves 10 times more limits. At sunset, the last desert camel came back. All the students who had passed the assessment were gathered in attendance. At this time, a huge black carriage ride over, stopped in front of everyone. Chris and Tobu jumped out of the carriage. Chris turned towards the carriage and opened the door. Students heard tinkling of chains. The sounds were followed by a distorted figure that was pushed down the carriage. It stumbled onto sand. Tobu and Chris weren't polite in the slightest. They brutally pulled the man's chains to kneel him in front of the students. Silence fell. There were no sounds but the wind hitting the sand. Dudien's pupils suddenly crunched as he saw the figure. His fingers tightly clenched onto sleeves and cold sweat oozed down his spine. The figure locked in chains was an alchemist. Moreover, this alchemist was in the same faction as the one he had killed. A life alchemist who also had experimented on his own body. Moreover, the results of the experiment were also terrible. His body was burly. However, after his hip a twisted tail was grown which was wrapped around his body. Alchemist's face was full of meat knots. A scimitar-like extremely sharp bone dagger was raising out of his left wrist. But the most appalling sight was on his chest. On the center there were sharp fangs extended. This simply could not be longer called a person. Everyone stared. The children who had never seen an alchemist stared at the monster with wide open eyes. Tobu looked around everyone, indifferent, smiled and said, "First of all, I have to congratulate you for passing the survival assessment. You can be ravaged by me for the next 6 months. Secondly, some things should be known to some of you." He used his leg to kick the burly man onto ground. "This is. Your parents should have told you about alchemists, the devil's apostle." The children burst into an uproar. No one had expected for an alchemist to appear in front of them. All kinds of evil legends about alchemists emerged in their minds. That kind of a body confirmed the tales, this is the embodiment of the devil. This time, in the place where you were assessed, alchemists were hidden, resulting in a lot of people accidentally eliminated. At this time Chris stood out and said, but fortunately there are no casualties. I have to congratulate all of you because most of the students who had encountered the alchemists were not scared but rise up against them. She raised her hand and said, there is a Knight of Light with us today. All children were burst into an uproar again, full of excitement, after hearing her words. Knights of Light were not part of military career, but they were exclusive knights under Holy Church, a symbol of noble character and pure will. Even the nobility would wish their children to marry a Knight of Light because of their glory. There is a Knight of Light. I would have never expected Knight of Light to help to capture this demon. I'm way too happy. I want to his appearance. I want to meet the Knight of Light. Mason, Sham, and Zach were filled with emotion. All of the students were envious as someone had assisted the Knight of Light while capturing the demon. Think about the excitement of the situation. How great a chance it would have been. Chris smiled and said, in total 38 students encountered an alchemist attack. But 17 of them not only failed to surrender to the devil but delayed it until the arrival of the Knights of Light. Especially last night. Lorien not only avoided the alchemist but also secretly left a signal which allowed Knights of Light to smoothly pursue the demon and capture it in one swoop. I declare that all the candidates who assisted the Knights of Light in capturing the alchemists will be rewarded with the second military merit at once. This will be recorded under your household. In the future, if you become guards, you will begin with a rank of captain and will have a right to become a knight. When she mentioned that knight part, it referred to the knight of military. Hearing her words, students had envy flushed in their eyes. Knight and the guard are completely two different levels, Although the Knights of the Military and Knight of Light are not comparable in status, but it is still a favorable status. It's only slightly inferior to the noble status. If in the future you can become a Knight Commander, then your status would be higher than of noble families. As for the Knight of Light, nobles would kill to have them as guests in their households. In addition to what we know, 10 days ago Knights of Light found several footprints near an alchemist's secret base. According to their speculation, someone was caught by the alchemist, but successfully escaped. I don't know who was it, so please stand out so that I could appoint your military reward. Chris suddenly said in sweet tone. Hearing this, everyone was surprised. For a moment they looked at each other. Dudien's heart was tightened. He saw Zach and Shem look at him, waiting for his actions. Only 3 of them know the story. Looking at the eyes of the 3, filled with envy and excitement, Dudien's heart sank. After they had ran out, he had cleaned and concealed the footprints in worry that some other alchemist may follow them. When he had killed the alchemist, he wanted to conceal his whereabouts because he did not expect Knights of Light will appear. It was to avoid other alchemists. Thinking about it right now, he had done the right thing by hiding their footprints. He had tied the alchemy notes onto his leg. If it was detected by a Knight of Light, he didn't know what kind of a big crime it was. Chapter 28. The Dark King, Chapter 28. Judgment. The first 6 chapters have been edited. Although Chris said that the military reward is extremely attractive, but Dudien was sensible enough to dispel the idea of claiming. He was not sure what kind of clues were recovered from the chamber of the alchemist by the Knights of the Light. He had used fire to destroy everything, but the traces of the explosion would not disappear. If he was taken into a cross-examination, he would inevitably expose flaws. Moreover, his trousers had the alchemy notes. Once searched out, the consequences could be disastrous. He just wanted to stay away from Knights of Light. The farther the better. Knighthood opportunity. Dudien Hart was in pain but bite his tongue to be a bit more sensible regarding his security. Dean, very good. Zach's face was full excitement. He was about to go on to talk but saw Dudien's harsh look, so he stopped. Mason, Zach, and Shem could not help but be surprised for a moment. After few months of get along and 10 days of survival test, they have long been in tacit understanding of each other's temper. With a simple look they could understand the meaning behind Dudien's eyes. They couldn't help but wonder, this is a golden opportunity. The golden symbol of the highest status that a civilian could reach has been sent to Dudien's feet, and he only needs to take a step forward. This is the dream of countless people. However, under the vision of Dudien they came to stop. 3 as one did not say anything. They respected Dudien's choice, as incredible and puzzled they were. they knew that they could not convince Dudien otherwise, so they didn't want to stop him. Chris looked at the crowd, which was in silence. Nobody had responded. She slightly frowned. At this time, suddenly a voice sounded. Short boy holding his hands together, who looked a little nervous, came out of the crowd. Chris was relieved, looked at him deeply, smiled and said, "Congratulations, you will be rewarded by the instructor and it will be recorded onto your household. Now let us appreciate how the Knight of Light is going to punish the demon." As she finished talking, a person slowly came out from the previous huge black carriage. His body was clad in silver-white armor. He was a young man with a handsome appearance. He was tall. For most of the onlookers he was full of ungodly charm. All the children's excitement was exposed on their faces. Relative to the proud aristocracy, civilians were in high regards towards just and benevolent Knights of Light. Dudien looked at the young Knight of Light. What was he going to do? Was he going to award the child who was posing for Dudien's accomplishments? He had a bit of regret in his heart. If he had known that everything would pass by in a simple manner, then he would have stepped forward, not matter what. He couldn't but blame himself for overthinking everything. He secretly sighed but knew that as mischance. He can only put it away onto the deep parts of his mind. In any case, being cautious is always good. As for military reward, he shook his head, these thought aside. At this time, the young Knight of Light passed by Tobu and stepped in front of the alchemist. There was a touch of smile on his face as he slowly pulled out his sword. The sun was reflected on the blade of the sword. Melk, in the name of the Father, decides the fate of this devil. Light will eventually expel all the darkness. He gently talking. In a moment his hands used to momentum to charge sword towards the alchemist's head. Alchemist's head was immediately cut. The blood was spewing out from the neck, his body fell to the ground. Alchemist's head rolled a few times before coming to a stop. The blood was flowing into the sand. In front of the bloody scene most of the children were scared and took a step back. But soon they were excited. Shouting the last words that Melk had spoken, light will eventually expel all the darkness. One after the another, the words echoed out in the desert. Dudien did not want to be found strange, so he also followed by gently shouting the words. But in his heart, did not any of you saw the blood that flew into the sand? Like the rest of us, it was colored in red. In this world, it is not uncommon to publicly try inmates. Countless people would come as onlookers to the trials of the convicted prisoners who had done great evil. Perhaps in this monotonous world it is kind of an entertainment. Soon, the man named Melk wiped his sword, turned and left. Chris and Tobu escorted Dudien and the other children using the black carriages back to Scavenger Special Training Ground. After returning into their bedrooms, everyone felt that this tattered, shabby little room was so valuable and solid. I heard that this time total of 8 alchemists were captured. Dasha was sitting on a soft chair. She smiled and continued, "I am even jealous of this feats. You have done a great job. I believe that after the special training of this group ends, you will be promoted to the Hunter School. It's time to go to there to discipline those group of monsters. They may need your bitterness more than this group." Tobu Riley said, "The main credit is not mine. It was the Mel family's young genius who killed a 2-star alchemist. Mel House seems to re-emerge." Dasha mouth revealed a trace of a smile and said, "I heard that there was another kid who escaped from a 3-star alchemist's clutches and that alchemist was found dead." Tobu replied, "According to Knight of Light's point of view, there had to be a 4-star alchemist who had killed him because of the amount of power used in destruction of that place." Dasha's eyes narrowed slightly and said, "It's been a long time that we had detected activities of a 4-star alchemist. And even if there was one in the desert, I estimated that including you and those Knights of Lights, no one would come back alive." Tobu breathed lightly, "The next time when there is such a thing, I want you to give me a notice in advance. I don't want to be kept in the dark." "I'm tired," said Dasha and yawned. Tobu slightly smiled. He could only respectfully withdrew. Giant Wall Calendar. Year 291. The rainy season. The experiment is ready. I have thoroughly grasped the structure of the human body. Today I will experiment with my own body. Soon I, Roseyard's name, will be forever engraved in the Alchemist Hall as the immortal. I will also become the new creator. Dudien was secretly looking at alchemy notes when no one was around. This alchemist who experimented and refined his own body had recorded everything. From the scrawl of goose feathers, Dudien could see the trembling once in a while and feel how excited the alchemist had been. Chapter 29. The Dark King, Chapter 29. The Church of Darkness. The long-age question was answered in this chapter. Dudien was 9 years old when he woke from frozen storage. So I went back and read the Ross. I have made a mistake because it was not Dudien who was 12 but his sister at that time. It was not little but elder sister. Sorry for that winky face. Failure, what is the reason? Nerves and blood vessels are connected. Everything has been double-checked. It should have been a successful experiment. Why can't I get the same strength as Knight of Light? Where was the mistake made? Ah. Dudien thought of the mutation on Roseyard's shoulder. It was recorded as a failed experiment in the alchemist notes. However, the thing that caught Dudien's attention was the phrase, the same strength as Knight of Light. So their purpose was to create their own Knights of Light. No, to be precise, attaining the same level of power of the Knights of Light. Could it be that Knights of Light are genetically modified and held the power beyond the imagination of ordinary person? This was definitely an explosive news. The thing is, alchemists would use the surgery to genetically modify their bodies. If Knights of Light are somehow or in some way are modified, then the Holy Church is an extremely terrible existence. At least behind the scenes some shady deals occur. Dudien was shocked. He continued to read. The alchemist notes contained 10 years of experimental experience recorded by Roseyard. After the failure of self-modification, Roseyard had become cautious according to notes. So he would steal children to experiment on. In case he would be successful, he would kill the child. Then he would share the details and results of the experiment with the Church of Darkness. After his deeds accumulated to a certain extent, it would be regarded as a meritorious service. He could certify to a higher level, TL, the number stars if you guys remember, and access to greater rights and resources. It was noted in Roseyard's notes that this Church of Darkness is made up of alchemists, potion masters, puppeteers, and other heterogeneous occupation holders of great forces. They were not just limited to people outside the wall, but some members of noble families, some civilians from residential areas and slums, and even some people from the military were part of this organization. In simple terms, if the Holy Church was standing proudly in sunlight, then the Church of Darkness was the horrible monster lurking in the darkness of the night. Holy Church, military, Church of Darkness, Dudien murmured. From his current perspective, these three forces were like a tripod which were involved in everything that happened within and outside the giant wall of Silva. As of now, he didn't know which force would be the best to join, military of Holy Church. For now at least he wouldn't be leaning towards Church of Darkness. I know way to less, Dudien sighed. His heart was at loss as he didn't know where to go in the future. He couldn't stand the constraints that would be implemented by the military. Holy Church was more inclined towards beliefs and faith. He couldn't face his own conscience if he seek refuge with the Holy Church. It can be seen from the alchemy notes that the various powers gathered within the Holy Church were in nature scientists of different fields. However, the group of scientists without law and moral restraint were no different from the devil. Dudien felt that for a small person like him to climb the world's top would be very difficult. However, he never thought that ascending to the heavens would be an easy feat. In his mind another idea emerged. How easy would it be to live a normal life? As the idea appeared, he thought of the sharp words said by the aristocratic girl. Jura couple's humble posture in front of the nobles was reflected in front of his eyes. He remembered how he had almost lost his life in Hunter Castle. He gently closed his eyes and asked himself, would you be able to live a normal life? What would be standing in your posture in that case? Would you be able to escape the disaster the next time? No, no. When his life will be threatened, he wouldn't be able to show resistance. He slowly opened his eyes. There was an unprecedented firmness in his eyes. Even at the expense of freedom. Even if I have to abandon my faith. Even if I have to abandon the compassion. I should live well. If I'm left in the darkness, I will crawl and dig out my own way into the light. He grabbed a small iron sheet and cut a finger-long wound on his arm. He clenched his teeth to overcome the pain. His eyes were becoming increasingly cold as he whispered, Dudien, feel the pain. You were the one who came up with such a cowardly idea. Are you worthy of the sacrifices that your parents and sister made to give you the only opportunity to survive? He clenched his teeth and looked at the blood flowing from his arm as if to keep in mind the pain that he felt. He was quietly warning himself that in the future, no matter how many difficulties or obstacles he would encounter, he would never leave his direction. He would never let this world to tame him. Mason, who came back to the bedroom, saw the blood flowing from Dudien's arm. He sent him off to infirmary. Scavengers in training. Time flew by, and in the blink of an eye 3 years passed. Dean, the special training is finally over, and today is the graduation ceremony. We will finally be able to go home to our parents, Zach smiled. He was the only dutiful son in the bedroom. Every month he would take a day off to see his parents. Dudien, Mason, and Shem only occasionally visited their parents. They usually wrote letters to them. Dudien smiled. In the last 3 years his appearance had greatly changed. The color of his skin is not as white as before, but a healthy wheat color because of the exposure into the sun. His height was 1 meter and 60 centimeters, which was one of the tallest within the peers. After all, he was only 12 years old this year. Hey, this was the most special bedroom in the dorms. All 4 of us finished the training. Macon grinned, exposing 2 rows of white teeth. Shem said, I hope in the future when we will be in military, we would be assigned into same unit. However, in case we are scattered, don't forget to come my family's pub. I will treat. Dudien and the other 2 have long heard about Shem's tavern. Mason laughed and replied, absolutely. Let's go or we will be late. Dudien said. All of them went out to huge school field. There were dozens of students chatting with each other. Mason sadly said, 3 years ago there were more than 300 people. We are really lucky to graduate. There are people who haven't come yet. Shem shrugged, I had counted before. There are 106 students who would graduate. Zach looked at the woods outside the school field. Who are they and why they are coming to our graduation? Dudien, Shem, and Mason looked towards the place Zach was pointing. They saw Toby, but there were 8 individuals besides him. They were talking and laughing. All of them were dressed in an elegant manner. Chapter 30. The Dark King, Chapter 30. God's Blessing. Alchemists are angry at fellows who haven't disabled their ed blocks yet. All the students were standing on a neat row. Tobu turned towards the 8 and said, you wait. He went to front of everyone. He exposed a rare smile. First of all, congratulations. Finally you have turned from a garbage to a true warrior. However, the real test begins from this moment. You will leave this warm cradle, face the real-life death situations. Most of the students were surprised, as not all of them understood the meaning behind Tobu's words. Dudien's eyes flashed. He knew that Tobu was about to announce their identity as scavengers. Tobu looked at students with the puzzled expression, said, from the moment of graduation, you will get a new identity. Not of the guard, but of the scavengers. Scavengers. Everyone looked at each other. I know, most of you are hearing about this for the first time. Tobu slowly said, I will be straightforward. Scavengers from the perspective of the job level are much higher than guards. Actually on the same level with knights of military. However, knights are loyal to the legion and the noble family they serve. In my opinion, they are a group of weaklings. While scavengers are the last defense line of humankind. Everyone was stunned. Same level with a knight. That is such a renowned status. Even in their dreams they would not expect it to get such a huge return after 3 years of hard work and persistence. Tobu looked the excited faces of students and continued in calm tone, however, the difference between scavengers and knights is that one is in the dark while the other one is in the light. In simple terms, scavengers are behind the scenes. You are not allowed to disclose your identity as a scavengers even to your parents, siblings, or lovers. It is a military secret. You will be provided with a guard identity as a cover. When you can accumulate enough merits, you will get permanent residence in commercial district. After Tobu's last words, all of their eyes began to glow up in hope. Nevertheless, living in commercial district is every civilian's desire. Instructor, what do scavengers do? At this time, dark-skinned student asked. Your job, he said, is to go to the safe area outside the giant wall. Gather all the information and resources outside the giant wall and bring it back here. All the children burst into an uproar. They realized that there is no free lunch. No one had seen the world outside the giant wall. But deep in their hearts they knew that there are great dangers outside the wall. Instructor, can quit it? Someone had raised their hand to ask. Tobu indifferent replied, yes, your solatium will be send your house after your death. Their hearts turned cold. They were not given any choices. You do not have to worry. Although it's very dangerous outside the giant wall, but we are not wasting 3 years of time and resources just to cultivate cannon fodder. The places where you will be sent will be clean security zones. As long as you are careful, nothing will happen. The death rate of scavengers is not high. Tobu looked around the crowd and said, and when you will go out of the giant wall, you will receive the blessing of God. God's blessing. Everyone was confused. Dudian couldn't help lift his eyebrows. Tobu lifted his hand and pointed towards the 8 people that had come with him. These 8 represent military and 7 consortiums from the commercial district. You can choose to join any of them. Afterwards you will work for chosen consortium or military. All the resources that you will collect outside the giant wall can be converted into a great fortune. I remember there was a scavenger who had picked up a strange object outside the giant wall and received 100,000 gold coins for it. Everyone startled. 100,000 gold coins. This is simply the wealth they cannot think of. Dudian did not expect that scavengers could extract commission on the things that they had picked up. It seems it is a good career to get rich. But more easy to get rich, the more risks should be involved. At this time, the 8 people came to the front of the crowd. The youth from the left side was the first to talk. I'm here on behalf of the military. Anyone who wants to join army should come over to me to sign the contract. If you join with us you could join the commercial district in the near future. I'm from Sterling Consortium. We can provide admission to commercial district. Our commission rate is 10%. Another gracefully dresses woman spoke. The others began to introduce their affiliated consortiums and information about contracts. Dudian came to understand that this training center was supported by those 7 consortiums and the military. Military couldn't have supported this large of operations under the noses of noble families. So it seems they have chosen to share both expenses and results. To his surprise, there is no one from the Holy Church. At this time, other children have come before the representatives of various consortiums and military to make their selections. All of them more or less are giving the same conditions, because they are competing with each other, so there is not much of a difference in the welfare offered. Dean, we should choose the same consortium, Mason said. Shem asked, which consortium? Or maybe military. You go and check the conditions they give. Dudian said and went towards Tobu and said, Instructor, which one should be the best to choose? Tobu looked down at him. He was impressed with Dudian. Whether it was his improvement by leaps and bounds in the tenacious endurance training at the beginning, his impressive results at examinations, or his performance for the last 3 years. He winked and said, you have excellent chances with any of the choices, as they will offer you a personal proposal. But in between us, Melon Consortium has a great potential. Dudian was surprised, as he did not expect that Tobu's recommendation is not the military but the consortium. Tobu turned away to leave when Sham, Mason, and Zach came up to catch him. Sham said, we checked all of them. Most of the conditions are similar. Military has the best treatment while their commissions are low. All these consortium have varying conditions, but their commissions are higher than military. For example, Lorian just joined Sterling Foundation. They will give him 15% from everything that he will extract plus God's blessing every month. What? At this moment, excited sounds echoed all around the field. Everyone could not help but look. Dudian saw the gentleman who represented the Sterling Foundation. Chapter 31. The Dark King, Chapter 31. First. It's Lorian, Mason said, what's he doing? His body's color changed to blue and veins popped up all on his face. Lorian shouted in pain. In a moment, his dark complexion disappeared. It was as if with this roar, Lorian had recovered. His muscles gradually relaxed, veins were hidden. He took a deep breath and looked down at his palm. His face was a bit surprised. Suddenly, he a squat and jumped into the sky. Wow, everyone exclaimed in surprise. Lorian had actually leaped up 2 meters high. Not his head but his feet were at least 2 meters high off the ground. The silence was spread within the audience. All were aghast looking at Lorien. They had gone through hellish training for the last 3 years. Although their physical condition were many times better than their peers, but all of them had limits. Jumping up for 2 meters was nothing but a simple nonsense. However, Lorien had done. He had jumped and broke those physical limits. Dudien knew that Lorien's performance throughout the 3-year training was very good but was way too far from such a super physical condition. Is this God's blessing? Dudien muttered. Shem heard his words and was stunned. What? At this time, the graceful woman who saw the surprise on Lorien's face, smiled and said, "This is the blessing of God. From now on you will get a blessing every month. I hope you will make good efforts to create more wealth for the mankind by giving your best." Lorien was agitated. He bent on one knee and spoke in respectful manner, "For life, Lorien will be loyal to God." The graceful woman smiled, held him up, and looked up to the others. "Everyone will be blessed by God after joining Sterling Consortium." After she spoke, the other children understood clearly that the sudden increase in Lorien's physical power was due to God's blessing. For a time, all the children were stirred up by the spectacle. "Noni, aren't you so kind," said the other, a slender man, "we all supply God's blessing." Grace Woman smiled, "The rules did not say that I'm not allowed to take the first step, did they?" The other man was stifled for a moment but continued to speak out in loud voice, "Anyone who joins our Green Consortium will get God's blessing as soon as signing agreement. You will get your share when we return to Consortium, so do not be worried." Hearing this, most of the children were relieved. However, the ones who were hesitating moved towards Noni to join the Sterling Foundation. At this time, a cry echoed. Dudien saw a short boy standing in front of Noni. The same things that happened to Lorien were repeated. He also jumped to reach more than 2 meters of height. Children were excited by the thought of having access to such an extraordinary power. Dudien's heart was shocked. This time he had clearly seen the woman called Noni injecting an old-fashioned syringe. There was pink liquid inside the syringe. She had injected it into the boy's arm, which led to the latter's physical power to rise in an instant. God's blessing, ah. It's clearly a genetic agent. Dudien was shocked, not that they will use gene agents called God blessing. But with the technology of this era, how could they produce such significant effective genetic agents? Extraction of genes is already a nano-level technology. They don't have microscope, electricity, or precise instruments. How could they produce them? It's called God's blessing. So it must be provided by Holy Church. Dudien was brainstorming. He always had felt that Holy Church held great secrets. Perhaps this gene extraction technology is one of the secrets of Holy Church. So amazing. It is God's blessing. Do you know how long it lasts? Mason, Zach, and Sham were excited. Thought of having power beyond the ordinary person's capability had given them an unbelievable ecstasy. At the bottom of his heart, Dudien was worried as he didn't know about the side effects of this medicine. He hoped that they wouldn't be too much. The alchemists such as Roseyard had given their life to work on alchemy to get results such as this. It was a gene agent. In hands of alchemists it is devil's power. Only the same thing when appeared in hands of Holy Church, it is just and legal. Look, it Espewe. She has chosen the Melon Consortium. At this time, Zach and Shem suddenly cried, pointing towards a girl. She was same age as with them. She was tall and white. Her breasts were still budding. She had been able to seize the eyes of many boys. The most attractive thing about her was her exquisite oval cheeks. Mason blushed and said, "What do you mean?" Zach laughed and replied, "Come on. Why are you so shy? Don't you like her?" Mason stared at him, said, "Do you want to be strangled to death?" Geez. Zach looked at him in contempt. Dudien smiled. He knew the Beiwei was one of the most dazzling girls from the training camp. She was Mason's secret crush. Dudien didn't expect her to select Melon Consortium. He thought of Tobu's recommendation and said, "We should choose Melon Consortium then." Sham was shocked, "Really? Dean, you still think about everyone?" Zach shook his head. Mason flushed and cast a grateful look at Dudien. Dudien smiled and they lined up for the registration. Soon, it was their turn. You are Dudien. Elegant Man seemed to recognize Dudien. There was a trace of cordial smile shown on his face. I have read your information. The results are very good. You were first on endurance results and comprehensive knowledge. Also, you have shown quite impressive performance. Especially a year ago, the assessment where you had searched for the materials. You were second to find all 4 required materials. Dudien smiled and said, anything special for me? I did not expect you will join our consortium. Elegant Man smiled and said, with us, you will be the object of seed cultivation. I believe if you had joined another consortium you would have the same options. This is your contract. Then, from the bag he took out another contract. Mason, Sham and Zach were full of curiosity. They stretched out their necks to look. Dudien looked. The general content was same with the normal contract. But several of these benefits were better than the normal contract. First, once a month he will be given God's blessing before his mission. In addition to the monthly limit of tasks and missions, he would be given 30% reward on excess materials after the identification. The most eye-catching this was that he also received a temporary residence permit in Commercial District. Chapter 32. The Dark King, Chapter 32. Noble Party. Holy Church ordered Knights of Light to persecute the unbelievers who are using adblock in this website. For your own safety, turn off your adblocks or whitelist wuxianation.com. If I'm not mistaken, commission on extra material was mentioned to be 30%. Isn't that 3 times our limit? Temporary residence permit for 10 years. Wow. If I knew this, I wouldn't have eaten and slept for the last 3 years to study and exercise only. Mason, Zach and Sham were crying out in envy. Other children's attention was attracted by their loud voices. More students came to surround them and most of them saw the terms of the contract specially made for Dudien. They were looking at contract with envy and jealousy. Lorien, who was next to the Noni, wrinkled his brows. He selected the Melon Consortium. Does this guy know something which I don't? There was a bitter taste in his heart. He asked Noni, why is his contractual benefits so high? I was second on endurance results, third on comprehensive knowledge, and there was not much of a difference with him. Noni looked back at him, smiled sweetly. This is always like that. The first will always have preferential treatment. Lorien had an ugly look on his face. He did not care much about 30% commission that Dudien had got, but 10-year period temporary residence permit in the Commercial District made him extremely jealous. Kid, I see you are not convinced. Although your results are excellent, but this kid called Dudien had the best performance almost in every examination. We value the results of examinations a lot. The results of training such as stamina and endurance level are secondary. At this time, a man standing by Noni lightly laughed. Lorien's face darkened when he heard him. Are you satisfied with the conditions in this contract? The elegant man representing gently asked Dudien in presence of people that had gathered over. Dudien quickly glanced at the terms of the contract, pondered a moment, said, it is written that every 3 months I have to comply with the consortium's arrangement for a scavenging trip. In addition, the rest of the time I have to stay in the consortium for special training. Is it possible to amend this? The elegant man was surprised for a moment. He didn't expect in the face of such rich welfare for Dudien to negotiate. He smiled and said, if you feel too tight with the 3-month trip, then we can add another month. 4 months are the limit. Dudien shook his head. Even once a month is not a problem. You misunderstood me. What I mean is I would like to have my own free time. Elegant Man was startled for a moment. He hesitated but replied, this has to be approved by the people above. I can't make a decision on my own. Especially you will be the object of seed cultivation. Hey, little guy. If they can't comply with your condition in the Melon Consortium, we can in Huaseng Consortium. At this time, another burly middle-aged man laughed. Elegant Man's face slightly changed, angrily said, Bolton, stop the foul play. How I haven't thought about it. Another mature woman smiled, we Green Foundation can also accept the conditions of Mr. Dean. Elegant Man's face changed, biting his teeth he spoke to Dudien, well, I promise you. Dudien was relieved. In his heart he was secretly thanking the other two. After we go back to the consortium the contract will be modified. Elegant Man said, I haven't brought God's blessing so it will be provided to you when we go back. For now stand behind me while I register others." Representatives of other consortiums gave up in regret as they saw the foregone conclusion. Only the burly middle-aged man hadn't given up. "Little man, if they breach the contract when you are back in consortium, don't lose your hope. Come over to Huaseng Consortium, as my words will be effective at all times." Elegant man looked at him angrily. "Bolton, stop with your slanders." The burly middle-aged man shrugged, turned, and continued to draw other students. Elegant man's eyes fell on Mason, Sham, and Zack. "You are together, right?" Macon nodded and said, "Yes, give us some benefits to improve the contract." Elegant man turned silent, helplessly said, "Really cannot be modified. The rules are set." Mason looked up and saw no other consortium to compete, to help drive up their own worth. He was disappointed, said, "Well." Elegant man saw through his move, cannot help but be angry. Soon, all the 7 consortia and the military finished with the registration process. Each consortium led their recruited students towards the respective carriages which stood outside the school field. Dudien opened carriage's curtain to look the school field. This place would be imprinted in his memory forever. "Goodbye," he murmured. Carriage galloped away through bustling area. The pedestrians who saw the flags inserted on the carriages quickly gave way to them for fear of blocking the movement of carriages. A few moments later, several carriages that belonged to Melon Consortium came to stop on a busy street. Recruiter was the first to jump down the carriage to take the lead. He took them into a huge building. 8 young girls came out to greet him. Afterwards they turned towards the carriages and opened their doors. "Please follow us." Dudien came of the carriage to the elegant man standing close to him. "Let's go. I'll be the one to take you through the procedures." Dudien went after him to keep up. Mason and other 2 followed after Dudien. The other carriages were led by the girls, and followed. After claiming identity cards, you will be the personnel of Melon Foundation. From now on you will enjoy the Melon Foundation's welfare, but also will have to comply with the rules of the Melon Foundation. Elegant man told while they were walking on a path, "Dean, you are the seed selection of this session. There is a noble party tonight, you can come to attend. You should meet up with the upper-class people who belong to our Melon Consortium." Dudien, surprised a moment, asked, "Is it possible I don't go?" Elegant men startled back, said, "Why?" "I want to go back and look for my parents first," said Dudien. Appreciation was reflected in Elegant man's eyes. "It's understandable, but don't be in a hurry to meet your parents. This is a rare opportunity. There are lots of people who crave to participate in this party. There will be hunters too." Hunters. Dudien immediately thought back to 3 years ago. Fernando and the other one had taken him to Hunter Castle for test. It was a confidential information back then. However, it now appears that although the identity of hunters and scavenger are hidden, but it's limited to only ordinary people and normal guards. "Okay," said Dudien, coming down. Mason spoke in envious tone, "What a luck. All the good things are falling onto your foot. I'm going to die of jealousy." "You shouldn't. When we go back, Dean should treat us for meal," Zack suggested. "Agreed." Shem immediately attached. Dudien turned a blind eye, ignored them. Saying, "What is a hunter?" Mason curious authentic. Elegant man smiled and said, "Let's go into the hall." A beautiful woman greet them over there for registration. The elegant man turned towards Dudien and said, "You come over with me." Chapter 33. The Dark King, Chapter 33. Dinner. Dudien was taken to a luxury office. There was a tough old man who sat by the table. A pretty young girl was sitting on his leg, holding a burgundy cup full of crimson red wine. "Peter, when are you going to learn to knock on the door?" The old man patted the girl's buttocks and motioned her to leave. Elegant men laughed, "You should lock the door first." Old man noticed Dudien, who was following at Peter's rear. "Is he one of the fellows who was picked in this group's scavengers? Why have you brought him here?" Peter smiled, "He is the seed of these batch. His contract needs to be modified a bit. You should rest assured, everything is within the scope of permission." "Oh." The old man looked at Dudien with interest, said, "Top of this batch, huh? Kid, you are doing pretty well. If you continue in the same pace you may turn into a good hunter." Peter smiled, and said to Dudien, "You sit first, the new contract will soon be ready." He turned to the old man. Identity medals and uniforms, please. Old man smiled, opened a drawer, pulled out a stack of black uniforms. Dudien sat down next to the sofa. When he saw the uniform he could not help but think of 3 years ago. The 2 officers who took him to training grounds had worn exactly the same uniforms. This is your scavenger medal and uniform. Peter handed to the clothes and medals to Dudien. There were 2 different medals, said, in case of civilians you should produce the first medal which will cover your identity as a guard. In case of aristocrats or others, you can use the scavenger medal. Dudien looked at the 2 medals. The silver medal engraved with crossed swords was for guard identity. However, the scavenger medal was matte black. The giant wall of silver was engraved on its outline. You are a melon consortium seed cultivation object. Peter sat down beside Dudien, said, every time after scavenging, the consortium will give you a bright spring which is purchased from the Holy Church. It is a very expensive syrup used to clean your body's radiation value. As a result, you won't have to worry about radiation problems while scavenging. The consortium will give you special attention after you accumulate certain amount of points. You may get the opportunity to access the hunter school, and as long as you can stick through the training, you can become a hunter. Fernando had told him that to become a hunter you had to have a light physique. He didn't expect that there are other methods that could lead to become a hunter. I will work hard. Dudien caught medals and uniforms and replied seriously. I'm sure you will, Peter encouraged. How is the status of hunters in comparison to nobility? He asked. Peter laughed. This depends on level of hunters, but also level of nobility should be taken into account. If you are an excellent scavenger, then aristocrats will politely try to curry favor with you. After all, scavengers bring a lot of wealth to aristocracy. It can be said that scavengers are aristocrats' favorite workers. But in the eyes of the number of financially influential noble families, scavengers are nothing. Only hunters meet their appetite. Dudien's eyes moved. There are levels in hunting division. Of course there are. But it's too early for you to know about that. Peter encouraged, the benefits of being a hunter are much more than you think. They not only get qualifications for permanent residence in commercial district, but if they accumulate enough merits then their future is limitless. Dudien nodded slightly, knowing that Peter was throwing a bait. In his heart he was not concerned about permanent residence in commercial district or having qualifications to start his own noble lineage. These are the appearances created by the rulers of this world. Being a hunter, scavengers, noble or anything else is just a privilege which can be taken away at any time. It's not real power. It's been 3 years since he had decided to get the power to control his own destiny. No longer be dominated or trampled. If he continued on to live a humble life like an ant, one day or other, ultimately he will be trampled to death. By the way, in 7 days you will have to go to your first task as a scavenger. Peter laughed, you have to do well. Your results will determine way too many things that you don't even imagine. Anyway, I would advise you to wash up and clean yourself. At night, I will pick you up. Don't forget aristocrats hate dirt and mess. Comb your hair neatly. Dudien nodded slightly, I'll pay attention to details. At this time, the door opened and the previous girl came in. She handed the new contract to Peter. Peter looked at it and handed it to Dudien. Check, there should be no problems. Dudien once again went over the contract from start to finish. He saw that the changes had been made on proposed places. He took the pen and quickly signed under his name. All right, Pete closed the consortium's contract and said to Dudien, don't forget to wear your medal at night. It is your status symbol. If necessary, keep it on you at all times. I will. Okay, someone will take you to a temporary place to live. Dudien nodded, turned, and left, pulling out the door smoothly. Mason and the other 2 had received their medals and uniforms. The woman had explained all the details to them. As she saw Dudien coming out of the room, she said, come with me. I will take you to your temporary residence. A small castle was arranged for Dudien and others. The environment was comfortable and clean, with servants and gardeners at their disposal. However, it was a temporary residence for 3 days. After 3 days, except Dudien, the other 3 had to return to their own houses in residential district. Consortium's carriages would bring them in case of tasks and missions to the required assembly site. Dean, can you take us with you? Mason and Zack looked at the neatly dressed Dudien. They knew that he was going to attend the aristocratic party. Dudien turned sideways in front of the mirror, arranging the cuffs. He felt satisfied with his looks. He spoke to the wailing Mason, "Help me, Mason. Bring the boots." Dudien dressed neatly. From the windows he saw an exquisite carriage galloping in front of the castle. He put his medal on his shoulder and left to the door. "Well, you look pretty handsome." Peter opened the car curtain to look at him. Dudien smiled and went into the carriage. Before long, the carriage arrived at a secluded place in the commercial district. There was very large manor covered by high walls. There were rows of lanterns hung around to light the surroundings. More than a dozen carriages were parked outside the manor. The banquet had already begun when Dudien and Peter arrived. The faint sounds of melodious music echoing from the estate. "It looks like we're a bit late," Peter smiled, "and remember to be cautious." Dudien nodded. Peter showed his identity and invitations and entered the estate with Dudien. Along the trail to the banquet hall there was dedicated servants to open the door for them. The path was lighted magnificently and the sound of music was slowly drifted out. "It's Moonlight Beauty" by Master Haydn. Peters quickly rushed into the hall. Dudien was about to keep up Peter when his eyes met another tall figure's. He was wearing a fine silk clothing. There were emerald rings on his fingers. Middle-aged noble glanced at Dudien. When he saw scavenger medal on Dudien's shoulder he frowned. "Who told you to come in?" Part 2 of the series ends here. Thank you for watching and listening. If you find it interesting, please give us a like, a comment and a subscription so that we have the motivation to make the next videos.